The most powerful emperor in the Americas is holding a book to his ear. He is sitting on a golden litter in the center of a stone plaza in the Andes Mountains. His robes are woven from fabric so fine that Spanish soldiers standing 20 feet away will later compare it to silk. The emeralds in his headdress are the size of walnuts. 80,000 soldiers are camped on the hillside above this city. Every one of them would die for him without hesitation. He is holding a book to his ear because a Spanish friar has just told him it contains the word of God. He listens. The book says nothing. He looks at it for a moment. Then he throws it on the ground. What happens next takes less than 30 minutes. The cannons fire. The cavalry charges out of the buildings surrounding the plaza. 6,000 unarmed attendants, nobles, priests, the men who sang his praises as they cleared the road before his litter, are cut down where they stand. The soldiers on the hillside watch their god-emperor dragged from his litter by a man who cannot read. They do not move. By sunset, the largest empire in the Americas belongs to 168 Spaniards. Atahualpa did not walk into that plaza because he was foolish. He walked in because he had done everything right. He had thought through every angle and decided the Spanish posed no serious threat. He had 80,000 soldiers. They had 168 men. He had invited them deep into his own territory where his army surrounded them on every side. He had come to the meeting unarmed as a deliberate demonstration of contempt, because a man with 80,000 soldiers does not need weapons to meet a delegation. Every calculation he made was rational. Every calculation was wrong. The world Atahualpa was calculating from had never produced a wrong answer. The Inca Empire in November 1532 was not a civilization in decline. It was the largest empire the New World had ever seen. 4,000 miles of territory running the length of a continent, from the jungles of present-day Colombia down through Peru and Bolivia and into the deserts of Chile. 10 million people. A road system more sophisticated than anything in Europe. Relay runners who could carry a message from one end of the empire to the other in days. Agricultural terraces carved into mountain slopes so steep that modern engineers still cannot fully explain how they were built. Storehouses packed with enough food to feed an army for years. A military that had never lost a war on its own soil. At the center of all of it, the single point from which every road, every decision, every gram of tribute flowed, was the Sapa Inca, the emperor. A man his subjects believed was the living son of the sun. That man was Atahualpa. He had not inherited the throne peacefully. His father, Huayna Capac, had died, probably from smallpox, the invisible disease racing ahead of the Spanish through a continent that had no immunity to it, without clearly naming a successor. What followed was 4 years of civil war between Atahualpa in the north and his half-brother Huascar in the south, a war that killed perhaps 100,000 people. A war that divided the empire's elite, exhausted its armies, and stripped the administrative machinery that had kept 10 million people organized and fed. Atahualpa won. By the autumn of 1532, his generals had captured Huascar. The last serious resistance to his rule had collapsed. He was camped at the hot springs near Cajamarca, a city high in the Andes, cool and quiet after years of war, resting before the march south to Cusco, where he would formally claim the throne that was already his in everything but ceremony. He was 30 years old. He commanded the most powerful military force in the Americas. He had just won the hardest fight of his life. This is the moment the Spanish arrived. Francisco Pizarro was not what the Inca expected from an enemy. He commanded fewer than 200 men. 62 of them were on horseback. He had 3 muskets and 2 small cannons. He had been marching inland from the coast for weeks, climbing through mountain passes at elevations that left his men gasping, moving slowly through territory where a single Inca garrison could have blocked them indefinitely. He had not been blocked. This was Atahualpa's first calculation. He had known about the Spanish since they landed on his coast. He had spies watching them from the moment they began their march inland. He knew their numbers. He knew their weapons. He had received detailed reports on their horses, animals completely unknown in the Americas, and had considered what they meant militarily. He had even had a demonstration arranged. When Pizarro's lieutenant Hernando de Soto rode into the Inca camp to deliver an invitation, de Soto put his horse through its paces directly in front of the emperor, charging and pulling up so close that the animal's breath touched Atahualpa's face. Atahualpa did not flinch. One of his attendants did. Atahualpa had that man executed before De Soto had finished riding back to the Spanish camp. The message was not for De Soto. It was for every Inca soldier watching. These animals were not supernatural. They were not gods. They were large and fast and unfamiliar, but they could be managed. Fear of them was weakness, and weakness was not permitted. This was not the behavior of a man who had been deceived. This was the behavior of a man who had assessed the threat and found it manageable. His calculation went further. He had not just allowed the Spanish to march inland, he had guided them. Inca nobles had met Pizarro on the coast and escorted him through the mountain passes. Passes that Inca engineers could have blocked with a few hundred soldiers. Passes where the thin air and the terrain would have stopped any European army cold. Atahualpa had chosen not to block them. He had chosen to let them come, because he wanted them exactly where they were, deep in his territory, far from the coast and any hope of retreat, surrounded on every side by his army, in a valley he controlled. At a meeting he had agreed to attend on his own terms, in his own time, with as many or as few men as he chose to bring. According to his own sources, and the Inca intelligence network was sophisticated, with runners carrying reports from every province. The Spanish had behaved poorly on the coast. There were accounts of violence against local populations, of stealing food, of treating Inca subjects with contempt. Atahualpa had heard these reports and filed them away, not as reasons to attack. As information about who he was dealing with, he had also heard something else, something his spies had reported from the coastal settlements where the Spanish had spent months before beginning their march. These men were not ambassadors. They were not representatives of a distant king come to establish trade relations. They were desperate men from a poor country who had crossed an ocean looking for gold. They had been told that the empire to the south was wealthy beyond imagination, and they had come to take as much of that wealth as possible. Atahualpa found this understandable. He had spent 4 years fighting his own brother for control of resources. He knew what desperation looked like. He knew what ambition looked like. He had a plan for both. The Spanish would come to Cajamarca. He would meet them. He would assess them in person, because Atahualpa trusted his own judgment above any report from any spy. He would determine what they wanted and what it would cost to satisfy them. If they wanted gold, he could give them gold. If they wanted trade, he could offer trade. If they wanted to be absorbed into the empire as a novelty, strange men from across the water with interesting weapons and unusual animals, he could find a use for them. Several of his advisors had suggested recruiting Spanish soldiers and their horses directly into the imperial army. The horses in particular were worth understanding more closely, and if they proved to be a genuine threat rather than an opportunity, if the meeting at Cajamarca revealed that these men were something other than what they appeared to be, he had 80,000 soldiers on the hillside above the city. He had been playing this kind of chess his entire adult life. He had outmaneuvered Huáscar for 4 years. He had read every rival, every ally, every subordinate with the precision of a man whose survival had always depended on correctly assessing who was dangerous and who was manageable. Pizarro's men were in a valley surrounded by his army. He had invited them there. He was not walking into their trap. He was setting his own. The problem, the specific invisible problem that would turn everything he had carefully constructed into catastrophe, was not something any intelligence network could have told him. It was not a failure of information gathering. It was the existence of a category of threat that had no precedent in the world he had grown up in. A threat that no Inca had encountered before. A threat that no calculation based on Inca experience could have accounted for. He did not know what a man with nothing left to lose would do in an enclosed space. He was about to find out. What he found out would cost him everything. Stick around until the end and subscribe if this is your kind of history. November 16th, 1532 began exactly as Atahualpa had planned it. He rose late. He had no reason to hurry. The Spanish had been waiting in Cajamarca since the previous afternoon. Those men in an empty city, surrounded by his army, going nowhere. He spent the morning in ceremony and preparation, the rituals that accompanied every public appearance of the Supper Inca. His attendants dressed him in robes of vicuna wool so finely, woven that each thread was invisible to the naked eye. The emeralds were placed in his headdress. The golden ornaments that caught light from every direction were fastened at his chest. His litter, a platform of gold and wood, carried by 80 nobles selected specifically for their height, so it would ride level, was prepared in the camp's center. He was not going to a meeting, he was going to a demonstration. The procession that left the Inca camp that afternoon was designed to communicate a single message to every person who witnessed it. Power does not hurry. Power does not arm itself against petty threats. Power arrives when it chooses, in whatever form it chooses, and the world arranges itself accordingly. Thousands of attendants preceded the litter, sweeping the road clear of stones and debris with their hands, singing praise songs, clearing a path not because the road needed clearing, but because clearing it was what attendants on the Sapa Inca required. Spanish scouts, watching from Cajamarca's rooftops, sent word back to Pizarro. The procession is enormous. It is moving slowly. It will arrive before sunset. Pizarro had been in position since the previous night. What Atahualpa did not know, and could not have known, was what was happening inside those buildings. He knew the Spanish were in Cajamarca. He knew they were surrounding the central plaza. He did not know that they had spent the previous night in a state of pure terror. Contemporary accounts record Spanish soldiers weeping, vomiting, praying. Some wet themselves. These were veteran soldiers who had survived years of colonial warfare in the Caribbean and Central America. Men who had seen violence in forms that would have broken ordinary people. They were terrified, not because they doubted the plan, but because they understood the mathematics of what happened if the plan failed. His men against 80,000 soldiers on the hillside above. If Atahualpa arrived with his armed guard, instead of his ceremonial retinue, if the army descended from the hills before the ambush could be sprung, if anything went wrong in any direction, there would be no retreat and no survivors. Pizarro had positioned his cavalry in the buildings with the largest doorways. His infantry occupied the remaining structures around the plaza's perimeter. 2 small cannons had been aimed at the plaza's center. The arquebuses, primitive firearms that fired a lead ball with a noise like a thunderclap, were loaded and ready. Every man had been told his specific role. Every man had been told what the signal was. A white scarf raised by Pizarro himself. No one was to move before the signal. No one was to speak, cough, or make any sound that might alert the procession before the litter was in the center of the plaza. They waited for hours. The plaza was empty and silent. The shadows moved across the stone as the afternoon wore on. Then, late, much later than expected, because Atahualpa was not a man who kept other people's schedules, the procession began to enter the plaza's northern gate. What followed was not what Pizarro had scripted. The procession was larger than anticipated. 7,000 attendants entered the plaza before the litter appeared, unarmed, as Atahualpa had announced, but 7,000 nonetheless. The plaza filled with bodies. The singing grew louder. The sweepers cleared the stone, and then the litter appeared at the gate, the 80 noble bearers moving in perfect synchronized steps. Atahualpa elevated above the crowd, surveying the empty colonnaded buildings around him, with an expression that Spanish accounts describe as calm curiosity. He looked around the plaza. He saw nothing. No Spanish, no soldiers. Empty doorways and empty colonnades. He asked, loudly enough for his attendants to hear, where were the strangers? At that moment, a single figure emerged from the colonnade on the plaza's eastern side. A friar named Vicente de Valverde. He was carrying a crucifix in one hand and a breviary, a small prayer book, in the other. He walked toward the litter with the measured pace of a man who had rehearsed this moment and believed in the theological authority it represented. Beside him walked Felipillo, the young interpreter Pizarro had recruited on the coast and trained for 3 years specifically for this encounter. Valverde delivered the requerimiento. This was a legal document the Spanish crown required conquistadors to read aloud to any people they intended to conquer, a formal declaration that the authority of the Pope and the King of Spain extended over all the peoples of the earth, that these peoples were now required to submit to that authority, and that any resistance would be met with justified military force. It had been written by lawyers in Spain who had never seen the Americas. It was being read by a friar to an emperor who had never heard of the Pope, spoke no Spanish, and was being translated by a young man whose grasp of the relevant theological concepts was imperfect at best. Felipillo translated. Something was communicated. What exactly was communicated is a question historians have been arguing about ever since. What is clear is what happened next. Atahualpa asked to see the book Valverde was holding, the breviary, which Valverde had described as containing the word of God. He examined it. He turned the pages. He held it to his ear. As the friar had suggested, the word of God could be heard within it. He heard nothing. He looked at the book for a moment longer. Then he threw it on the ground. Valverde retrieved the book and turned toward the colonnade where Pizarro was watching. He shouted, "The accounts vary on the exact words, but agree on the substance, that the infidel had thrown down the word of God and that Christian soldiers were absolved of any sin they committed in what followed." Pizarro raised the white scarf. The cannon fired. The sound in that enclosed Stone Plaza was unlike anything any of the 7,000 people in it had experienced. Not because they had never heard loud sounds. The Andes produce thunder that shakes the ground, and the Inca used drums in warfare whose noise carried for miles. But a cannon firing in an enclosed space at close range produces a concussion that is not just sound, but physical pressure, a wave that passes through the chest and the skull and disrupts thought before thought can organize a response. The horses came out of the buildings. No Inca account could have prepared for what happened next. The animals Atahualpa had observed and assessed and found manageable were different creatures in open ground at a controlled demonstration. What came through the doorways of Cajamarca's plaza at full gallop, armored, carrying armored men with steel lances, into a space packed with 7,000 unarmed people who had nowhere to run. That was something outside the category of manageable. The unarmed attendants had nowhere to go. The plaza walls were high. The gates were narrow and instantly jammed with bodies pushing in every direction simultaneously. The Spanish cavalry moved through the crowd in systematic passes. The arquebuses fired into the densest concentrations of people. The infantry came in behind the cavalry with steel swords. Atahualpa's bearers, the 80 nobles whose role was to carry the litter, were cut down one by one. When one fell, another stepped forward to take his place, lifting the litter with whatever hands remained. The Spanish accounts describe this with a mixture of military admiration and something closer to incomprehension, men offering their bodies to be cut down rather than let the litter touch the ground, dozens of them in succession until there were no more left to step forward. The litter finally tilted. Atahualpa had been watching the chaos from the litter with the specific attention of a man who had spent his entire life reading situations and responding to them. He had watched the first cannon fire and felt the concussion in his chest before the sound registered. He had watched his attendants fall and seen the horses and understood, with the cold clarity that had made him master of the Andes, that this was not a skirmish. This was a designed event. Every element of it had been planned before he entered the plaza. The empty buildings, the silence when he arrived, the friar with the book, all of it was preparation for this. He had walked into a trap he had believed was his own. Pedro Pizarro, Francisco's young cousin, 17 years old, present in the plaza that afternoon, wrote about what he saw on Atahualpa's face during those final minutes. Not terror, not confusion, something he described as fury, the specific fury of a man who has understood something too late. Atahualpa was not crying out. He was not pleading. He was watching. Even as the last of his bearers fell and the litter began to tilt, he was watching the men around him with the eyes of someone still calculating. He had one calculation left: stay alive. Atahualpa fell. Pizarro himself had been fighting toward the litter through the chaos of the plaza. He reached Atahualpa as his own soldiers were attempting to kill the fallen emperor, and physically placed himself between them, taking a sword wound to his own hand in the process. He was the only Spaniard injured in the entire engagement. Atahualpa was pulled to his feet and held. Around him, the plaza was a killing ground. Thousands of his attendants were dead or dying. The army on the hillside above the city, 80,000 soldiers who had watched the procession descend and had heard the cannons and the screaming, had not moved. They were waiting for an order from the Sapa Inca. The Sapa Inca was a prisoner. The army did not move. This is the detail that reveals everything about how the Inca Empire actually functioned, and why capturing its emperor was not just a military victory, but a systemic one. Veterans of the civil war against Huascar, men who had spent years fighting in conditions that would have broken most armies. They had weapons, they had numbers. They did not move because no one had told them to move. The Inca military ran on a chain of command that terminated in a single point. The Sapa Inca gave orders. Generals executed those orders. Soldiers obeyed. The system worked with extraordinary efficiency when the top of the chain was functioning. When the top of the chain was a prisoner in a stone building at the center of the city, the system had no protocol. There was no contingency plan for the capture of a living god. There was no secondary command structure that could authorize an attack. There was no general with the authority to act independently in a situation this far outside established precedent. The most powerful army in the Americas stood on a hillside above Cajamarca and waited. They would wait for 8 months. Atahualpa spent his first night of captivity doing what he had always done in difficult situations. He assessed, he observed, he calculated. He had been wrong about what the Spanish would do in the plaza. He understood that now, with the clarity of a man who had just watched his assumptions collide with reality. But being wrong about one calculation did not mean the game was over. He was alive. His captors had made a point of keeping him alive. Pizarro had taken a wound to his own hand, preventing his soldiers from killing him, which told Atahualpa something important about his value to these men. He was a prisoner, but he was a valuable one. Valuable prisoners had leverage. He began to observe his captors carefully. What he observed was simple. Every Spanish soldier who entered his quarters looked at the golden ornaments on the walls, at the decorations on his clothing, at the offerings his surviving attendants arranged around him. Their eyes moved to gold, the way eyes move to movement, involuntarily, immediately, before any other thought. He had encountered this reaction in his own court, in minor chiefs who came to present tribute, in merchants who dealt in precious metals. He knew what it meant. These men wanted gold more than they wanted anything else. He looked at the room he was being held in, approximately 22 feet long, 17 feet wide. The walls rose perhaps 9 feet before meeting the ceiling. He stretched his arm upward. The accounts differ on exactly how this happened, but agree on the gesture, and drew a line on the wall at the height his fingers could reach. He told Pizarro he would fill the room to that line with gold, then fill it twice more with silver in 2 adjoining rooms, in exchange for his freedom. Pizarro agreed. The historical record preserves this moment as one of history's most extraordinary negotiations, a prisoner offering a ransom so vast it exceeded the combined treasury of every European kingdom, and a captor accepting it. But the agreement concealed 2 very different calculations about what would actually happen when the gold was delivered. Atahualpa believed that delivering the ransom would end the captivity. He had spent his adult life in a world where agreements between powerful parties were honored because both sides understood the long-term costs of breaking them. His empire functioned on reciprocal obligation. The Sapa Inca received tribute and labor from his subjects, and in return provided protection, food redistribution, and religious legitimacy. Agreements had weight. Breaking them had consequences. He had no reason to believe this agreement would be different. Pizarro had no intention of releasing him. He accepted the ransom because the collection process was itself useful. Gathering gold from temples and palaces across the empire required Inca cooperation. Messengers sent by Atahualpa, instructions transmitted through the imperial administrative network, provincial governors complying with orders from their captured emperor. The ransom collection was not just a transfer of wealth. It was a mechanism for extending Spanish knowledge and presence throughout an empire they did not yet control. The gold began to arrive, not immediately, not quickly. The empire was 4,000 miles long and the temples were distant, and the roads, however sophisticated, required time to traverse. But it came steadily. Sheets of gold stripped from the walls of the Temple of the Sun in Cusco, golden figures from provincial shrines, ornaments accumulated over generations of tribute. Spanish soldiers melted it all down, destroying objects of irreplaceable artistic and religious significance to reduce them to uniform bars that could be weighed and divided, and the room began to fill. Atahualpa watched this process from captivity and continued to govern as best he could. He received messengers. He issued orders. He had his half-brother Huascar, who was being held by Atahualpa's generals following his defeat in the Civil War, executed, eliminating the one rival who might have offered the Spanish an alternative Inca emperor to work with. This was a rational move. This was also the move that Pizarro would later cite as evidence of Atahualpa's treacherous nature. The Spanish were learning. Every month of the ransom collection gave them more information about how the empire was structured. where its wealth was concentrated, what its vulnerabilities were. By the time the gold was delivered, they would understand the Inca administrative system far better than they had when they arrived at Cajamarca. They were also receiving reinforcements. Ships from Panama brought additional soldiers. Word had spread throughout the Spanish Caribbean that Pizarro had captured an emperor and was collecting a ransom the size of a continent's treasure. Men who had spent years in poor Caribbean colonies saw what was happening in Peru and began making their way south. The ransom was declared complete in June 1533. The gold room was full. The silver rooms were full. Atahualpa had delivered what he promised: 13,000 pounds of gold, 26,000 pounds of silver, the largest ransom in recorded history. Pizarro divided it among his soldiers. Common soldiers received shares worth more than they could have earned in decades of ordinary labor. Senior officers received fortunes. Pizarro's own share made him one of the wealthiest men in Europe. The king's fifth, the 20% of all conquest proceeds owed to the Spanish crown, was set aside in bars that would be shipped to Spain and would help finance a century of European wars. Then Pizarro's officers gathered to discuss what to do about Atahualpa. The argument against releasing him was straightforward. The Inca army had not dispersed during the 8 months of captivity. It was still there, still organized, still waiting for an order. If Atahualpa walked out of Cajamarca and returned to his camp, the order he gave would almost certainly not be a friendly one. The Spanish, for all the gold they had accumulated, were still vastly outnumbered in territory they did not control. Releasing the emperor meant releasing the mechanism that could organize 80,000 soldiers against them. The argument for releasing him was that they had made an agreement. The argument against releasing him won. Pizarro charged Atahualpa with crimes against the Spanish crown. The charges included practicing idolatry, maintaining multiple wives, and, crucially, ordering the execution of Huascar, which Pizarro framed as the murder of a fellow sovereign. A tribunal was assembled. Spanish officers served as judges. The verdict was predetermined. Atahualpa was sentenced to death by burning. He received the news with the composure he had maintained throughout 8 months of captivity. Then, through his interpreter, he asked one question. If he agreed to convert to Christianity, if he accepted baptism before his execution, would the method of death be changed? The Spanish agreed. A man who died as a Christian could not be burned. He would be strangled instead. For Atahualpa, this was not a religious conversion. It was a final calculation. The Inca believed that the body must remain intact after death for the soul to continue its journey. Fire destroyed the body. Strangulation did not. Even at the moment of his execution, he was working the available information toward the best possible outcome. He was baptized on the evening of July 26, 1533. He took the Christian name Francisco, after Pizarro himself. He was strangled that same night. The empire outlasted him by less than a year, not because the Spanish defeated it in battle. They never did, not really. A force that small could not defeat an empire of 10 million people in any conventional military sense. What they had done at Cajamarca was something different. They had removed the single point on which the entire system balanced. And without that point, the system, sophisticated, efficient, centuries old, simply stopped working. Provincial governors who had administered their territories with extraordinary competence for decades suddenly had no authority to act on anything beyond routine administration. Generals who commanded tens of thousands of soldiers had no one to order them into battle. The relay runners still ran. The roads still functioned. The storehouses still held their supplies. The infrastructure of the most complex civilization in the Americas was intact, but the man at the center was gone. Pizarro installed a replacement, a young half-brother of Atahualpa's named Manco, who had a legitimate claim to the throne and, more importantly, from Pizarro's perspective, had no army and no independent power base. Manco was everything a conquered emperor needed to be. He could perform the ceremonies. He could legitimize Spanish presence. He could order cooperation from provincial administrators who might otherwise resist. He entered Cusco in November 1533, exactly 1 year after Cajamarca, carried on a litter in a procession that deliberately echoed every visual element of Inca imperial ceremony. Spanish soldiers rode in the procession alongside Inca nobles. The message was carefully constructed. Nothing has changed. The Sapa Inca rules. Order continues. Everything had changed. The gold that had filled Atahualpa's ransom room represented only a fraction of what the Spanish stripped from the empire in the years that followed. The Temple of the Sun in Cusco, whose walls had been covered in sheets of beaten gold accumulated over 2 centuries, was dismantled. The sacred objects from shrines across the empire were melted down. The intricate quipus, the knotted cord records that documented everything from census data to agricultural yields to historical events, were destroyed by Spanish officials who could not read them and feared what they might contain. Centuries of accumulated knowledge vanished in a generation. The population collapsed. This is the number that sits behind everything else in this story. 10 million people when Pizarro landed on the coast. 2 million by the end of the century. The causes were multiple. Disease above everything else. The invisible army that had been preceding the Spanish since before Cajamarca, spreading through a population with no immunity. But also forced labor in the silver mines at Potosi, where Inca men were conscripted to work in conditions that killed them within years. Also deliberate violence. Also the destruction of the agricultural and distribution systems that had kept 10 million people fed in some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. 8 million people in less than a century. Manco eventually understood what he had been made into. In 1536, he escaped from Spanish custody and raised a rebellion that nearly succeeded. His forces besieged Cusco for a year, cutting off the Spanish garrison, coming closer to ending the conquest than anything before or since. The Spanish survived through a combination of desperation, native allies who had their own reasons to oppose Inca dominance, and the simple logistical reality that Manco could not maintain a unified coalition indefinitely. He retreated into the jungle. He established a small independent Inca state in the mountains that survived for 30 years, a remnant kingdom that kept the form of imperial rule, while the substance of it was gone. His successor was executed by the Spanish in 1572. That execution is usually given as the date the Inca Empire formally ended, but the empire had actually ended on the evening of July 26, 1533. The question this story has been carrying since its first line is whether what happened at Cajamarca was inevitable, whether Atahualpa's defeat was written into the structure of his civilization, the single point of failure, the centralized command, the emperor as living god, whose capture paralyzed everything. Whether a different emperor making different decisions would have produced a different outcome. The honest answer is that historians have been arguing about it for 5 centuries, and the argument is not settled. What is settled is this: Atahualpa did not lose because he was naive or foolish or primitive. He lost because he was operating from a complete and sophisticated understanding of the world as it had existed in the Andes for centuries. And that world had no category for what Francisco Pizarro was. Not in terms of weapons or horses or steel. Those could be observed and assessed and eventually countered. In terms of willingness, the Inca conducted war according to rules. Enemies were defeated and absorbed into the empire. Prisoners were taken and sometimes sacrificed, but the ritual had structure and meaning. Negotiations had weight because both sides understood the long-term costs of bad faith. Agreements were honored because the entire system of imperial expansion depended on conquered peoples believing that cooperation with the Inca was preferable to resistance. None of those rules applied to Pizarro. He had come from a world where the rewards for successful conquest were so enormous, and the penalties for failure were death, that the normal calculations of risk and reputation simply did not operate. He had nothing to protect. He had no empire that depended on his reputation for honoring agreements. He had no relationships in this continent that required maintenance. He could betray Atahualpa because betraying Atahualpa cost him nothing. Atahualpa's framework had no variable for a man with nothing to lose and no reason to play by any rules at all. His final calculation, the baptism, the preservation of his body, the Christian name taken from his executioner, was not surrender. It was the last move available to him in a game that had run out of board. He had assessed his options. He had chosen the one that preserved what could still be preserved. He had been doing that his entire life. He was 30 years old. Francisco Pizarro died 8 years later on the floor of his own palace in Lima, stabbed by fellow Spaniards in a dispute over the spoils of the conquest he had made possible. The men who killed him were not Inca warriors seeking revenge. They were his own countrymen. The empire he had dismantled had already been replaced by Spanish colonial systems that would extract wealth from the Andes for 3 more centuries. The plaza at Cajamarca still exists. The stones are worn smooth by 5 centuries of footsteps. The room where Atahualpa offered his ransom is marked by a plaque. Tourists stand in the space and look at the walls and try to calculate what it would take to fill them with gold. The gold is gone, melted down and shipped to Spain 490 years ago to finance wars that are themselves forgotten. What remains is the question the plaza keeps asking. A man with every advantage, the territory, the army, the intelligence network, the rational calculation, walked into a meeting he had arranged on his own terms and lost everything in 30 minutes. Not because his calculation was wrong, because the man on the other side of the calculation was operating by rules that no calculation could account for. He did everything right. It was not enough. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment below. Could Atahualpa have won? Or was the outcome written into the structure of his world before Pizarro ever landed on his coast? And does it change how you see the story, knowing that he was not foolish, that he was rational and careful and still lost? History has been arguing about it for 5 centuries. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories like this one.